Good morning. Welcome to the ECC room at the School of Social Work for the next installment of the Poverty Solutions Speaker Series, Real World Perspectives on Poverty Solutions. We're really glad to have you all here to join us today to hear from Trina Shanks. I'm really excited about this lecture. I have enjoyed crossing paths with Trina a number of times over the last few years, and I've always found it an engaging and learning experience when I do so. I also find that she is a very kind of real person with kind of real experience in these areas, and something that you often encounter at a university like this, but you don't always encounter. Sometimes you do encounter something that is a lot more theoretical. So I appreciate that. Trina Shanks is the Harold R. Johnson Collegiate Professor of Social Work here at the University of Michigan, and she directs community engagement for social work for the Social Work School and is the founding director of the Center for Equitable Family and Community Wellbeing. And so she's done a lot of kind of both real work and kind of administrative work for us. And so we're really excited to hear from her today. Trina, I invite you to give our talk.
Well, hello, everyone. I guess I can say good afternoon now. Thank you for coming, those who are here and whoever's watching online or watching in the future. I am excited about this talk. I actually took probably 4 different presentations and put them into this one. So I told Trevor that I'll just stop at 10 till wherever I am and then take questions. But just know that if there's any one of these things you want to go deeper into, I probably can. So with that, let's get started. So I'm going to talk first about just trends in income and wealth. And then talk specifically about economic insecurity and the implications that has for children and families. Talk a little bit about policy options, not because there's any one solution, but just to let you know there's lots of things people are talking about and actually some good experiments going on if you want to talk about a particular policy approach. And then if there's time, I could talk about my own work locally and nationally in child development accounts, housing, and workforce development. So here we go. Income is the money that people take in from employment, Social Security, and other sources, and it's mostly used for short-term consumption. So kind of paying for your day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month expenses. Assets are what people accumulate and hold over time for long-term security and to improve their condition. So think about this as, money in the bank in some sort of emergency savings account, stocks and bonds, retirement savings, even though usually with legal things you can't do it until after 60 or so, but business equity, real estate property, those are assets. And oftentimes people conflate them, so we'll talk about it a little bit. So my question is, which would you prefer? $25,000 a year in salary, where you'd have to work for 40 hours a week for 4 years to make $100,000? Would you like to have $100,000 in assets that you control that could be used to save, invest, or liquidate to make a large purchase? I'm sure all of you would rather have the $100,000 in one chunk than to have to work for 4 years to earn it. And so that's really the difference between income and assets, right? And so when you think about income in the US, hopefully these slides show up okay. Since the 1960s, the top portion of the income distribution has been growing, and the people at the top are getting more and more income, and the people at the bottom, in this case, the bottom 50%, are getting less and less. And so that's, I won't talk politics today, but just the reason that some people are disgruntled is it feels like other people are getting ahead where they're stagnant, right? And then if you look at this by race, same data points, but when you can see the little gray lines are when we have moments of recession or economic downturn, and you can see everybody kind of goes up and down, but at the bottom of the income distribution is usually Black households, and then Latinx or Hispanic households, and then toward the top are Asian and then white households. And I know that you can't just make assumptions for a whole group of people, and that within groups there's lots of diversity, but just to show that over time it's been pretty consistent that some groups are faring better than others. And then if you just want to look at something a little more explicit, even though things like education makes a difference, even within educational brackets, there are huge differences by race. So this just shows, if you look at everybody who has a high school education, there's a range of incomes, but women make less than the average, and then Black women make less than the women's average. And then even when you have a college degree, you make more, but again, women make less than the average, and Black women make less than the women on average. So you can see that even when you have education and you have things that should mean that you earn more income, there's still distinctions by race. And then if you think income is bad, wealth is even worse, right? So you can't even see the bottom 50% of wealth, right? Because the top 10% has almost everything. And you know, as you see on TV, there's a couple of billionaires who have lots and lots of money. And then you have families who earn a lot and who have a lot of assets and they have lots and lots, but those at the bottom often have zero or negative net worth. That's why you can barely even see the turquoise line, particularly after the Great Recession of 2009 and 2010. So that's where we are in wealth. So income is bad, wealth is worse. And then again, if you look by race, it's harder to track wealth over time because the data hasn't been collected in the same way. But Black households make a lot less than white households. And if you look at home ownership, really here, after the Great Recession, 2007 and 2009, every other racial group has recovered to their pre-2010 level, except for Blacks or African Americans. So Blacks still have lower home ownership now than they did at that time. And so again, wealth is worse than income, and there's racial disparities for both. And actually, when you look at wealth for Black or Latinx households, they often have 10 cents on the dollar, 12 cents on the dollar, maybe if it's a good year, 18 cents on the dollar of white households. So again, much more extreme and much worse racial disparities. And so what does that mean? You have less money in the bank, less savings, fewer physical assets, less business equity, fewer financial assets, overall less economic opportunity and fewer opportunities or options to help you and your family and your children get ahead. So then the question that I'm supposed to talk about today is, what are the implications for children? And so I want to just start out by saying the consequences of poverty are hard on children. And I've given lots of talks on this, and we're going to give a little bit, but I'm going to just make a few overarching points. So poverty is associated, and this is income poverty now, is associated with worse health outcomes, lower likelihood of graduating from high school, enrolling and graduating from college, housing insecurity and periods of homelessness, increased interaction with child welfare and criminal justice systems. And theoretically, this is thought to be that families or caregivers, parents or caregivers have less resources to invest in their children in terms of material goods and services necessary to enhance their child's development. But it also is theoretically that because you're living on the edge economically, you have higher amounts of stress, and that makes it, you're being stressed out about trying to make ends meet with limited financial means, and it also means that you have less to invest in parenting, or you have less time to care for your children. And I'd also want to make two more points before I go into what economic security and implications for children. One concept is intergenerational poverty. So that's when children who grow up in income below the poverty line themselves are poor as adults. So among children who grew up in the 1980s, about 34% are living in poverty themselves. So if they were poor as children, 34% are still poor as adults. And this percentage is even higher if you look at Black African American or Native American households. And there's a whole National Academies of Science report on that if you want to see the details. But one thing I want you to think about is, if you're in a household with 3 generations of poverty, so the grandmother, the mother, and the child all live in poverty, that means no one in their immediate circle have had money or access to opportunity. So these things about not having enough resources, being stressed because of finances, that wasn't just the current generation, but it's like 3 generations. And such generational poverty and the lack of intergenerational wealth, for sure, is all too common in the United States. And then one other concept, before I show some of the theoretical models I've done, is this concept, in addition to intergenerational poverty, the idea of concentrated poverty or hyper-segregation. So Douglas Massey estimates that about 32% of Black metropolitan residents live in areas of concentrated poverty, where the physical communities they reside in don't have enough resources, and they're all together in one space. And so I just want to kind of put those concepts out there before I go on to talk about what economic insecurity means for children and families. So take a breath, let's stop. Okay, so when you think about US compared to other countries, of the OECD countries, the kind of more well-off countries in the world, we always have higher level of child poverty. So if you look at the Scandinavian countries, less than 10%, US 3 times that much, right? And this isn't just, the last 5 years, this has been, for 40 years. And then this is some work I've done that actually shows the intersection between income and assets. So if you look at the blue or purplish lines, those are people who have multiple assets. So you have, and this is from the early childhood longitudinal study. So this is at birth. They didn't do a real calculation of net worth, but they did say, do you have money in the bank? Do you own your home? And do you have stocks and bonds? And so those who had all of those assets are the darker blue, or some portion of those assets are the lighter blue. And then the red are those who not only don't have assets, but also are below 1.85 of the poverty line. So if you look, the families who more than 50% have all the assets that were measured and are above 1.85 of the poverty line, those tend to be white. And if you look at the families where 2/3 are below 1.85 of the poverty line and don't have many of those assets, you're looking at Native American, Black and Latinx, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander households. And so it's not just that there is poverty of income and asset poverty, but if you look at the intersection, the families that are most likely to be both income poor and asset poor are families of color. And so I ask, what better predicts long-term outcomes for children? A developmentally appropriate assessment of their ability as a young child, or their economic and social advantage? Given that I'm giving this lecture, you probably can guess what the answer is. But just to give you some evidence. So if you actually take test scores in 8th grade, the lowest performing 8th graders, if they're in a high income household, are more likely to complete college at 30% than the highest performing 8th graders in a low income household at 29%. So of course, as you do better in 8th grade test scores, you are more likely to go to college. But those at high end, even if you don't do well in your 8th grade test score, you're more likely to complete college than those who are low income. And similarly, Chetty says, if you want to predict if you're going to go to college, look at your parents' income. It's almost perfect correlation. Almost nowhere in social sciences do you find correlation like this, right? So income is a much better predictor of educational success, particularly college and completion, than your ability. Which is sad, because we're supposed to be a meritocracy. We're supposed to be, if you work hard and you play by the rules and you do what you're supposed to do, then you can have a mobility and economic security. But at least when you're looking at household economic indicators, the economic indicators are much better predictor than ability. And so what are aspects of social and economic advantage? So you'll see in a model that I'm getting ready to show you that I really look at financial security. Then what does that mean for the stability of the family? And then what does that mean about the neighborhoods and the schools that you are part of? And I do this in 2 ways. I have kind of model 1.0, and then I have a new one that I just did 2.0, and I'll talk about them both. But this is really just the overarching framework, right? So I don't know if this, yeah, you can see it maybe. So when I look at financial security, I look at the combination of income, assets, and education. Because if you have income, you're more likely to go to college. If you have college, you're more likely to earn more income. And then if you have an education and income, you're more likely to build assets. And it may be because you're actually investing in building assets, but it also might be you're more likely to have a job that has benefits that invest for you in some sort of retirement account. And then on the opposite side, if you're in a household that doesn't have income and doesn't have education, then you're much less likely to be in a position to build assets, and those things build upon one another. So when I think about financial security, I don't look at just one, I look at the combination: income, assets, and education. And as I said before, that's highly dependent on race and ethnicity in the US, and actually on family configuration. So whether it's a single parent home or a 2-caregiver home. And so then those economic resources lead to what's going on in the household level. So what we can say for sure from evidence is the amount of parental stress and the likelihood of material hardship. That's highly dependent on income, assets. And then to some extent, parental behavior and parental involvement. And so all of those lead to the level of stress that the child feels or experiences, and that leads to these long-term outcomes in health, social, emotional development, and cognitive development. And then also the amount of assets you have determine the kind of neighborhood, community you live in. And so that's the general framework, but I also put it in a toxic stress context. So if you live in a tolerable stress household, first of all, you're more likely to have higher levels of income, education, and assets. So you're less likely to have material hardship. You're more likely to have parental involvement, less parental stress. And then if you do have negative things that happen, you have lots of positive relationships that help buffer you, right? And so again, and you're also in neighborhoods and communities that have more resources. And so you're gonna, if you're gonna make a prediction, have better outcomes over time. But in contrast, if you have in a toxic stress environment, one, you're less likely to have income, assets, and education. Because you are less likely, particularly have income and assets, you're more likely to face material hardship in your household. Your parents are more likely to be stressed. They may be less involved, if nothing else, because they're working multiple jobs. And then you're also living in communities where there's environmental toxins and broken systems. And that also leads to more stress faced by the child and poorer outcomes over time. And you notice you don't have that shield buffering of all the protective adult relationships that can help the child kind of negotiate those stressful situations. So this is, if you do want to take a picture of what economic insecurity does to families, it affects the family, it affects the household, and that leads to stress for the child, and that leads to poor outcomes over time. And just to kind of give some more examples of what that might mean. So if you're thinking about neighborhood obstacles, that's poor quality schools, less accessible healthcare, food deserts, so you can't find a place. You might have a grocery store that sells chips and cigarettes, but not fresh fruits and vegetables and meats. You're more likely to have inferior environmental quality. That's air quality, that's toxins in the soil, that's lead, as we know in some cities with lead pipes. You have less recreational outlets and green space, and higher prevalence of things like liquor stores as opposed to, again, fresh fruits and vegetables. And then the ways this may play out in the life of a child is you have cumulative exposure to multiple risk factors. So when you're looking at the psychosocial environment, you may be exposed to crime and violence. There might be greater family separation and disruption. You might be surrounded with more aggressive peers. You might be in a neighborhood with disadvantage. Whatever caregivers you have, they might have more conflict because they're fighting around. They're not fighting around resources, but they're stressed out because they're having difficulty making ends meet. It shows it's related to unresponsive and harsh parenting. And again, it's not so much because of what the parents care or love their child, but sometimes because you're in more harsh environments, you want to hold your children in because you know if you let them go outside and play, if you let them do things, they might be in more danger, right? You have weaker social network and support, less cognitive stimulation, things like books and toys that allow you to stimulate your brain and grow, particularly at young ages, less parental involvement and less residential stability. In work we did around child savings accounts, we asked how many people have moved in the last 5 years, and the lowest income families, sometimes they'd move 3 or 4 times in a year, have to go 2 to 3 different schools in a year. So it's not just, you don't have residential stability. It's like lots and lots of instability. You're moving around a lot, right? And then if you look at the physical environment, again, environmental contaminants, poor air quality, noise exposure, crowded housing conditions, housing that has structural defects, whether it's a leak in the roof or mold in the basement, right? Rodent and pest infestation, inadequate heating and cooling, no designated place to study, abandoned homes and reduced municipal services, and excessive street traffic. So these are just the things that have been documented to go alongside with household poverty. So I showed you my first model. This is model 2.0. It's going to come out December 2004. But if you want to click, you can see the full article. But I really wanted to more clearly designate what's going on in the household and at the individual level and what's going on in the neighborhood. And then rather than just saying, race kind of tempers this, I spent a lot more time thinking about what are the cultural and racial contexts and the systemic barriers that allow some people to make it to economic security, but also people more likely to fall from economic security. And then what, again, does that have implications for the household? So things like amount of income, assets, education, which I already talked about. This idea of having class status. So children know, like if they go to school and some kids have, fancy clothes and go on vacations and, their needs are being met, and then some come to school hungry and don't have those things. You know kind of where you stand. And then children know how they fit, but the parents also know kind of what their relative class status is. And sometimes there's some shame that comes with that. It shouldn't be, but it happens, right? So that feeling of where you fit compared to others as class status is something that also happens at the household level. And then this idea of Insurance. So what likelihood do you think that you're going to have economic resources for the future to meet your needs? And so that feeling of security also comes in. And so I'm sorry it's so small, I can barely read it. So, but I remember I did this, so it's important, so I'm gonna go through some of them. So when you're also looking at the household level, you're looking at things like, you know, how much you have to spend to make money. So the time you have and the time you have to spend, and then when you spend time working, how much money comes in. Things like access to post-secondary and the kind of schools you have access to. And then just things like parental stress and cognitive load. And then this idea of expectations for children. When we talk about child savings accounts at some point, but when you think about, when you ask a person who just had their child or maybe in preschool, what do you think your child's going to do when you grow up? How much education? Oh, my child's going to be a PhD. They're going to be a doctor. They're going to save the world. But then as they start having experiences in school and maybe getting kicked out of school, having problems in school, oh, I hope they graduate from high school, and so those expectations shift, particularly when you're at the low end of the income and wealth distribution. And so anyway, so that's on the household side. And then at the neighborhood side, the other people in your neighborhood, so the racial composition of your neighborhood, the likelihood of home ownership, the likelihood of being employed, the likelihood of poverty, how many adult role models you have, that percentage is different when you're in these hyper segregated, low income communities as opposed to more resource communities. And then things like, what sort of entertainment is available? How walkable is the neighborhood? What kind of green spaces? What access to childcare? Proximity to food? What are the school resources? What civic participation? How much influence do you have in your political elected officials? And again, all those things, both at the household level and the neighborhood level, impacts the child and leads to these different child outcomes. So I'll stop again for a second. And this is just a conceptual model. It's really hard to measure all these things at the same time. But if any of you interact with families, you can know kind of the stressors that families face. And not every family faces every stressor, depending on the local community, but some combination of these things are more likely if you are in low income and low wealth family. So I'll stop again for a second. We'll go to the next stage. And so people say, well, what do we do about this? What are some of the policies? And so I have here a list of policies. And actually, when I first came up with these, some of them seem like pie in the sky, ridiculous, never can happen. But now we actually have some pilots on some of these things. So again, they're not universal. They don't exist everywhere, but we can start to talk about. And so I'm going to list them quickly. But if you have questions or want to talk about some of these things in the Q&A, I'm more than willing to go more in depth. So if you're looking at possibilities for change in income, so one thing is to increase earnings. So raise the minimum wage, have universal basic income, have child allowances. And now in the US, almost all benefits are linked to employment, but there are pilots now with guaranteed income where you don't have to work. You could actually take care of your family or take care of your health and still get, it won't be a lot of money, but maybe $500 a month just to make sure you have some basic needs met. Or maybe you can get some training or education. You can make a higher income while you're transitioning. So this idea of increased earnings is one way to think about income. Another way is to expand active employment creation. So around the time of World War II, there were more guaranteed public jobs of last resort, as opposed to you're on your own. Hopefully you find a job. Hopefully it'll be a good job. Having this idea of creating good jobs for people, at least a job of last resort. And this might seem simple, and it's not necessarily helping people make more money, but making part-time, shift, contract, and variable work more stable and humane. I was actually listening in on a listening session with someone from the Department of Labor and CFPB, and they were saying, like, for example, if you work at a warehouse for Walmart, they have monitors on you. If you go use the bathroom, they may count it as time off task, right? And so they're trying to figure out how can we, make sure that some of this AI and surveillance stuff isn't so inhumane that it stresses people out or makes them do things that are unsafe, trying to meet quotas or trying to meet, these unrealistic expectations. So in addition to having more income, having the jobs themselves be more stable and humane. Of course, during the pandemic, we learned that we can do more around child tax credits and earned income tax credits. And we'll see if some of those things become permanent. Also having expanded childcare so you can have more stable employment, particularly if you don't work a traditional 9-to-5 type job. And then in strengthening unemployment insurance. So it's not just for those at the high end of the income distribution, but also goes down to those at the low end. So those are some ideas around kind of possibilities to change for income. And one thing I also want to say here is, as for those of you who are involved with poverty solutions, this kind of Flint RX is this idea of, at least for the first year of life, make sure that families have enough so that they don't have to hurry up and go back to work and put their children in unsafe situations or not have a chance to bond with their children. Having just little bits of money for short periods of time can make a big difference. And in addition to some of the experiments around guaranteed income at the very early stage of life, that first year, there's some things going on in Georgia and different places where they have lots of experiments about, particularly for single mothers, how can you provide more economic security when you have young children at home? So again, in maybe 10 years ago, this would have seemed like pie in the sky, ridiculous, never gonna do it in the United States, but there's some possibilities now of increasing income and not always having it. Okay, possibilities for wealth, right? So one thing is just reducing the role of wealth and income in building human capital. I mean, to have that high of a correlation of parent income and likelihood of completing college means that, we don't have the kind of access to opportunity, mobility that you think, we'd have in the United States. And so just reducing the fact that you have to have families that have income and wealth in order to be more likely to go to college and build your own human capital. Another thing is to stop privileging income from capital over income from labor. So for those of you who don't know, if you earn money in stocks and bonds, if you earn money kind of on the investment side, you pay less taxes than what you pay on the income side. And again, those are the people who are at the top of those income and wealth distributions that are earning a lot. So why are they getting more tax breaks? So just figuring out how to do that better. Redeploying wealth subsidies in retirement. So right now, if you work at a university and you have a 403B, if you are saving money on your own for retirement through an IRA, you get tax subsidies, but those almost always go to those at the top. So figuring out how can we either put money in accounts for those at the low end so they have money for retirement, regardless of whether they have those benefits on the job, or at least making sure a lot of those tax benefits go up and down the wealth distribution, not just those at the top. Similarly, redeploying wealth building subsidies for shelter. So rather than just doing, tax write-off for the interest that you pay on your home, what about those who don't own a home? Can you have some sort of a tax subsidy for those who are renting, or for when you're having these moments of instability, to have money that goes to homeless shelters or things like that? So redeploying a lot of the subsidies that go for shelter, rather than having McMansions or people who have multiple homes, figure out a way to kind of distribute that so it goes again up and down the wealth and income distribution. Things that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I'm going to talk about in a little bit, is having some sort of a lifelong policy of inclusive and progressive wealth building. I spend a lot of time thinking about child development accounts, and I'll explain those in just a second, but that's one way. There are countries that are doing it. So again, maybe that's something we can try in the United States. And then some people have bolder proposals around things like baby bonds, where you have money set aside so that by the time the child is 18, 21, they have $20,000, $30,000 in an account in their name, or reparations, which means actually doing repair for some of the racial inequities that have existed in our country over time. So again, these are possibilities for changing wealth. And again, in the past, some of these would have seemed like impossible, but there are discussions around them now. So let's see. If you want to talk about any of these, you can let me know. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just going into the child development account side, because that's something I do, and something that I think might be of interest. And then I'll stop. And then if there's any other things you guys want to talk about, I'll let you guys answer me questions. So when you think about progressive asset building, one of the initial attempts was individual development accounts. So it was proposed as inclusive, progressive, lifelong, helping those less than 200% of poverty build money for a home or business or education. And so the way it works is if you save $10, you might be matched 2 to 1, 3 to 1. So you'd have $20 or $30 put in an account. And then if you use it for asset building purposes, you'd be able to build money more quickly than if you had to wait for it to grow in value over time. And there was a federal bill, the Assets for Independence Act, that was passed, but rather than being inclusive, progressive, and lifelong, it was means tested, focused on individual savings and time limited. So it wasn't what was proposed, but it did shift the policy conversation, because before the 1990s, if you're thinking about things for people low income, you're thinking about food stamps, you're thinking about housing vouchers, you're thinking about maybe giving a little bit of income, but you're not talking about assets. So the question is, can we have the asset conversation even for those at the bottom of the income distribution? And at least IDAs shifted the policy conversation. So, maybe poor people can save, maybe poor people need assets, maybe we shouldn't just give them enough to survive, but we should also give them resources so they can thrive. So that's the thought. And so then, because it was time limited and it was stingy and it was multi-tentative, we said, well, let's think about another way of doing this. So rather than waiting until someone is making less than twice the poverty line, why don't we start earlier? And so that was the idea of child development accounts. So these are special, dedicated savings and investment accounts invested and initiated by public policy for lifelong developmental purposes. They include features to encourage wealth building and asset accumulation. The original vision was with my dissertation chair, Michael Sheraton. And again, he wanted to be lifelong, so it starts at birth, universal, all children included, progressive, greater subsidies for the poorest children, automatic, open without having to sign up or any action by the parent, and restricted for post-secondary education and child development purposes. So we think about it theoretically, you are providing economic resources that are in a financial investment. And then you also, hopefully, are going to be able to influence those psychosocial effects that we talked about. So there is less emotional distress, higher parental expectations, shifts in parenting practices toward things that will prepare children for college and career, and then more parent-child interaction, talking about finances, talking about plans for the future. And those are ways that we think child development accounts can make a difference. Willie Elliott, who's a professor here also, did research that shows even small amounts can be a big difference. Because people say, oh, if you have $2,000 or $3,000 account, that's not going to pay for college. College costs too much. But evidence shows that even if you have small amounts, even as little as $500, it makes low-income children in particular more likely to enroll and graduate from college. And so even small amounts can make a difference. So there was a national demonstration called Saving for Education, Entrepreneurship, and Down Payment. So it tested asset building accounts for children and youth with the idea of providing strategic and practical lessons on how you can create this inclusive system of child development accounts. So it lasted from 2003 to 2008. It piloted 12 child development programs throughout the country, and more than 1,200 low-income children and their families were able to open these accounts. And what was nice is it involved state and federal policy design, as well as marketing, development, and communication, so that as soon as lessons are being learned, it can be fed into the policy discourse. And then I was involved with the one in Michigan, which was called My Seed. It was in Oakland and Livingston County around Pontiac. And so one of the things that we learned is if you make people sign up, you're going to have some people who don't, right? So we had 62% who signed up for accounts, which among low-income Head Start families is not bad. But you had 38% that did not. And they tended to be related to income and race. So what we found from a lot of these demonstrations is you really want to have automatic enrollment. And ideally, rather than having people make decisions about where the money is going to be invested, because low-income families tend to be more risk averse and say, oh, just guarantee my income. It's better to have it in an asset-based income index fund where you are more risky when the child is young and it becomes more secure as they get closer to the age when they're going to use the money. And so if you're interested, there's a report that we did on that. And then since that time, there's been a lot of conversation about what a nationwide child development account policy might be. So the QR code is kind of the initial 10 universal design principles, kind of building on some of the things that Michael Sharantan talked about. But because there's some debate, for those who originally started talking about child development accounts and those who want to be more progressive and do things like baby bonds, we convened a group of people last year. And so we actually, even people who have differences of opinion on policy, had some agreement on policy design. So this idea of starting at the beginning, ensuring inclusion that reduces wealth disparities, making real investments so that the money grows over time, having structure, scale, and transparency, so you include all people, ease of access and use, and supporting vertical connection. So even if you have a national policy, make sure you connect with, let's say, the state treasurer's offices and local school districts and things like that, so that everybody kind of understands and can participate, so that you could reach those with high touch for those who need more support but also have a streamlined structure that includes everyone. So again, if you're interested in this, there's lots of papers talking about what the policy design might be. So where do CSAs exist? So around the world, there's some countries that have already gone all in. So Singapore, the UK started, but then when they had a change of government, they pulled out, but they did start a universal process. South Korea, Canada, Israel, they have child savings accounts nationwide. In the United States, we have it in pockets. So if you want to look at the cities, counties, municipalities, and states that have child savings accounts, you can go to the Prosperity Now website and see where these sites exist. But they're in 34 states. There's 7 states, mostly based on our savings, education, entrepreneurship, and down payment research, that actually at the state legislature level instituted an automatic child savings accounts or child development account with universal enrollment. So that's Maine, California, Nevada, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Nebraska. And one thing, some are red states, some are blue states, some are big, some are small. And so it's really nice to see that this idea is gaining traction. One of the more innovative models is in St. Paul, Minnesota. They're actually trying to link a guaranteed income program with the child savings account program with a larger amount baby bond program. And so stay tuned, because in about a year, we'll start having some results for what's happening with that data in St. Paul, Minnesota. We were just at a conference in DC and the mayor was there, and his main thing was, you know what, I don't want just to be concerned about or care for the, I don't know how many kids he has, but 3 or 4 kids in my house. I want to make sure in St. Paul, all kids are taken care of. And so in his mind, these pilots and demonstrations around child accounts, baby bonds, and guaranteed income for families are the way to go. So stay tuned for what's happening in St. Paul, Minnesota. In Michigan, there are child savings accounts throughout the state. And again, if you want to learn more, you can figure out where those are. And then Washtenaw used ARPA dollars. They're one of the few places that have used ARPA dollars to seed and launch a child savings account program. It's called My Future Fund. It started last year. They just had their 1-year anniversary that they celebrated a couple of weeks ago. And so they have a long-term savings account based in a 529 plan, along with family savings, entrenched in the educational program. And rather than starting at birth and waiting 18 years or starting in kindergarten and waiting 13 years, they actually they started with 1st through 6th graders. So now they have 2nd through 8th graders. And so in about 4 years, you're going to have young people who will have at least some money in an account they can use for college. And ideally, they're also building community partnerships and community champions to support these families so that those monies can be used for things that are helpful. So I could keep on going. I'll say one more thing, and then I'll open for questions. And so some would say, well, is our child development account the only way to think about, college access? Of course not. So there's always existed in every state 529 plans, which is 529 is kind of a piece of the IRS tax code. But every state that has a 529 plan, it tends to be people who are wealthier, people who are white who are participating. And even though places like Michigan, have outreach, have communication campaigns, are trying, when you create a child savings account program, then you can have something that everyone participates in, as opposed to what happens just naturally in the marketplace. But there are 529 plans. There are promise scholarship or debt-free models. So a long time ago, there was, kind of wealthy people said, I'm going to invest in a kindergarten class and I'm going to do I Have a Dream program. And so it gone from like individual investors to things like the Kalamazoo Promise. So you have Host City. I don't know if anybody was watching 60 Minutes 2 years ago, but during the pandemic, they said, we want to help kids in the south side of Chicago. And so they're saying, anybody who's in these, 5 or 6 high schools in Chicago, we're going to guarantee you money to go to college. So there's lots of ways of doing it. The one thing I would say is you don't want to wait until the juniors and seniors in high school. The nice thing about child development accounts is that you start early and you can have those conversations as the child is growing. But there are other models that exist. And as I said, child development accounts are growing in the US, and they definitely exist in other countries. And there actually are even a few places, Connecticut and DC, that have passed what they call baby bonds. They're not $20,000 at the moment, but they're starting with $5,000, and they're trying to get this system set up. Our take, or my take, those of us who spend more time in child development accounts, is why create a whole new system? Why don't you use systems that exist, but just put more money in them? But either way, there are places where these are being modeled, piloted throughout the country. The one other thought, particularly when you're looking at 529 plans, is redesign them so that they can be inclusive and be more like a child development account. So all states have 529 plans. So how can you modify them? One thing is, do you only want it to be for college and post-secondary education? Because there's some people who don't go on to college. So can you expand the uses for things like home ownership and business? And so it's being discussed. We'll see if it happens, but it's being discussed. And are there ways to, have the dollar amounts that you save be smaller so that they're more inclusive for low to moderate income families? So there's lots of ideas being proposed, and we'll see what happens with those. Actually, this is more likely to pass like in the next year, the modification of 529 plan, and then hopefully the next step could be actually putting money in accounts for all kids. And then one quick thing about child savings accounts and baby bonds. So Senator Cory Booker has proposed a baby bond legislation, and there are places that are trying it. Myself and others at Urban Institute kind of have some background information on, how you define baby bonds, where they exist. And really, Elliot has a really interesting article showing that really the origin story between baby bonds and child development accounts are the same, but they just emphasize different things. So baby bonds tend to emphasize larger amounts and as a way to reduce racial wealth gaps. And child development accounts tend to be, we want to put the plumbing in place, we want to put the infrastructure in place, we want the institutional side to be in place so every child can be included. And so rather than thinking them as being opposition to one another, why not create an infrastructure where every child is included and put more money in? So that's kind of my take on that. So I think I could talk about any of the other things if you're interested in the work I'm doing around workforce development, around housing, around reparations. I can talk about that, but I think I'll stop now and we will maybe pose some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. What questions do we have? We have one from Jesse.
Hi, my name's Jessie, and I have a question about, since your talks about the childcares. So I'm not sure about the circumstance of the childcare desert in Michigan, but what do you think that if the government put more funding toward solving the childcare desert can help to solve the poverty issue or the health issue in Michigan, things like that?
Good question. I don't know, I guess maybe you can hear, but she asked about childcare deserts. Now, I don't know the definition of childcare deserts, but I've spent time with childcare providers in Detroit, and particularly during the pandemic when many of them were in danger of going out of business. One of the things that the government does is they provide childcare subsidies for the individual parents, but they don't do a lot to support the childcare infrastructure. So if you have, let's say, someone who is caring for 10 or 15 people in their home, but they're not officially acknowledged by the state. They may not be eligible for some of those subsidies. So people have to pay out of pocket. Or it could be that they are trained, they're good with young kids, but they don't have the money to, upgrade their basement to meet some of the requirements for the child care field. So I think there's two places that you can help with childcare. So one, continuing to subsidize or provide vouchers or assistance for low to moderate income families so they can afford it. But then you also want to have people who are in the childcare field where they can earn more so that they can take care of their own families and that they can have the supports they need, particularly during economic downturns, so that they can be sustained and not go out of business. Because one of the reasons you have childcare deserts is where you have low to moderate income families, there's just not enough supply of childcare around. And so both sides, subsidies for the families, but also helping the infrastructure.
We have an active online audience today, so I'm going to step into the frame and ask a question.
Okay.
How early should we begin embedding these targeted programs into the leaders of tomorrow? Do you think it is a good idea to add these conversations to practice-based curriculums to help students think outside the box?
Interesting. Well, here at the School of Social Work, I teach a mini course, and if you're interested, you can take it next semester, called Show Me the Money. And it really allows social workers who are being trained to think about their own finances, because sometimes they're potentially either coming from low to moderate income families or don't know a lot about all the options around investment and building financial security, but then also helping people have conversations with their clients, right? Because oftentimes, you don't want to talk about sex, you don't want to talk about money, let's just talk about your problems, right? But I mean, if you don't deal with the economic underlying issues, you can have a really good after school program, you can have a really good counseling program, and all those are really helpful, but if there's still low income and low wealth, these strains exist. So I would say, as practitioners, not being afraid to talk about finances, and also thinking about how to make sure you yourself are financially stable. But then also, even if you aren't going to do this yourself, making sure that you understand the resources that exist locally. So where can people, get support for housing? Where can people get emergency money when they're facing unemployment or a deficit? Figuring out how to refer people so they can have some of their economic needs met, as well as their interpersonal and other types of needs met.
Thank you. Is there another question in the room?
Hi, Dr. Shanks. It's so great to see all your research compiled in one space. I know, peripherally about your research, but this was a really great demonstration, so thank you. I do have a question about researching in this field, and since we know the nature of wealth is that it grows over time, I imagine there's a lot of challenges collecting this longitudinal data and how that influences policy when you're trying to influence policy right now, but we might not reap the benefits of these programs until years in the future as these children grow. So what ways do you combat that when you're speaking with policymakers, and just how does that come up in your work?
Okay, good question. I have been in conversation with folks at DC, and we're trying to figure out here in September or October, there's a report on poverty. We know how many poor people there are, how much money people make, what's going on with that, how it's gone up and down over time. There are national data sets, so the Survey of Consumer Finances, that collect data every 3 years on wealth, but not all the time, and there's not a federal, definition of asset poverty. So I think just having it, you can't make changes about things that aren't measured, right? So if we could just do a little better job of let's figure out how we're going to measure asset poverty, how we're going to not just look at people's income, but also helping them being stable with assets. So I think even though, doing measurement and having definitions and collecting data isn't always, seem like the best way to help families, having good measures and being able to look at those things over time and for larger portion of the population, not just a sample, can be helpful. I would also say, though, one critique of child development accounts is, if you start at birth or kindergarten, you have to wait 18 years, 21 years, 13 years. Obviously, you could do what Washtenaw did and, do a whole bunch of young people at once. You don't have to just start one time and wait for that, to grow over time. So you could do larger groups or everybody under 18 or something like that. Is one way to think about it. But the other thing is really weaving together. One of the things that was looking at kind of the recommendations across baby bond and child development people is having vertical integration. So some of the things that are happening in New York City is the city of New York is putting a very small amount, let's say $50 in these accounts, right? But they're working with, local faith institutions or boys and girls clubs, or even at public housing a public housing place. There's a woman who grew up in public housing herself and said, I want to give back. So she went on a campaign to make sure that in addition to the $50 that was given by the state, every person that lived in this public housing building had another $1,000. And so she got partners but as a champion, she was able to do that. And so, and then there's two things that happen with that. One, those public housing residents didn't just have the 50, but they had the 1,050. But then once she brought attention to it, other people who lived in the public housing and then was able to go out and be successful came back and said, oh, I grew up here too, but I, got an education and I was able to go on and be a accountant, or I was able to, sometimes, you want the famous people who are like the athletes or the entertainers, but some of them are saying, you know what, something really boring, I was able to just go get my degree and do this, and this is where I came. And if you want to learn more about it, come talk to me. I came just from the same place you came from. So having those vertical relationships does two things. One, you can raise more money and do things, but you also bring attention and support in these places where maybe they wouldn't have existed before. So I don't know if that helps, but I think to answer your question, we want to measure asset poverty better. And then when you're thinking about providing inclusive asset building, don't just think about, starting at a very young age and waiting, do as many people as possible and building those vertical relationships.
So again, from our online audience, we are learning from some work with the Illinois Treasurer's Office that opening of these accounts is associated with families' familiarity with compound interest rates and investments, that is, financial literacy. What are your thoughts on the role of financial literacy in families' ability to take advantage of asset building programs?
What a great question. Okay, so first of all, people in the field don't like the term financial literacy. They really would, maybe financial empowerment, maybe financial capability, because really people at the low and moderate end of income distribution, they know how to use coupons and to make a penny stretch and to, make the most of the few resources they have, but oftentimes they don't have the resources to utilize, right? And then the other thing that we found in the research is if you have institutions that are inclusive and are relevant for a population, then they will rise to the occasion, if you will. So one of the things that we found is when you give families child development accounts, they will learn about compound interest. They will figure out, how can I make a deposit? They will learn, oh, if I put in $10 a month over 10 years, that $10 could end up being $15,000 for my kid or something. I mean, they, first of all, they're online calculators you can use, but even beyond that, they'll ask the question because now they have the product that they're using, right? So, so I think rather than thinking about financial literacy as, oh, people don't know enough, they're ignorant about finances, it's like provide the opportunities, make them inclusive, and then people will rise to the occasion or learn what they need to learn in order to make use of those.
Thank you. It's good to see you. You mentioned that in Connecticut that they're doing things. I'm from Connecticut, and I remember seeing these ads when I was young. So it's good to know that it was actually going somewhere. But that actually leads me to my question of how I like the idea of having these automatic enrollments, but how do you get past this
basically like I think of it as like a trust barrier to have and keep putting your money into the government. You're like, oh, well, I hope I get this when my child turns 18.
Good question. There's lots of ways I can go with this, but I'll start with a simple example and then I'll build out. So when we did the SEED demonstration, the Saving for Education Entrepreneurship Down Payment, we had 12 community-based sites. We had 3 or 4 that were preschool sites. One was in Harlem Children's Zone. If anybody knows anything about Harlem Children's Zone, those are trusted community partners, right? And so when the preschool student said, sign up, parents signed up. They had like a 90% immediately. Now in rural Arkansas, they took a year and a half to get everybody signed up in the accounts. Not because it was a worse program, but, nobody knew what it was. The person had just been hired. Who are you knocking on my door and telling me I have this great opportunity for you? It must be a scam. And so literally it took a year and a half to enroll like 100 accounts, right? And so that shows the difference between having a trusted partner like a Harlem Children's Zone as opposed to some unknown person starting from scratch. So trust and the reason for those vertical partnerships is important. Secondly, I would also say an issue that happens when you have automatic enrollment is, people move, they may not be aware that they have these things, or, they remembered when their child was born that $50, but then they don't know how to access it or whatever. And so again, that's where trusted partners help. So if you're working with the school system, you're working with after school programs, you're working with pediatricians, you work with people who do have regular contact with families, that's better than just having something coming in the mail from the treasurer's office. But also, it's nice if it's automatic. Even if you don't know about it, it's growing, it's there. It's going from 50 to 70 to 100, and so even if they don't save or do anything, it's still growing and is going to be there. And then by the time they are, let's say in high school, and they do have counselors and messaging and things, and so the main reason to start early is not just so that everybody's, I'm engaged with it for my whole life, but you start early so it has a chance to have compound interest, it has a chance to grow, and usually, particularly low to moderate income families aren't going to make that investment when their child is 1, right? So if the investment made for them, it starts to grow, then you could have even more outreach, when the child, is really going to make a decision about this, right? So if you start early and it has a chance to grow, that's one piece of it, but then you still have to make sure that you have culturally appropriate communication, you have partners that can explain things well, you make sure there are real options for people so they can use this money in a way that is going to be in their best interest and help them have a better future, right? One more thing, something I'm also doing, I keep talking about workforce development a little bit. There is a program called Zello that 80%, I've been told, 80% of people in the state of Michigan have access to this career and college and career exploration platform. But I talked to my daughter and she said, oh yeah, someone came into my social studies class and they made us do this little form and yeah, it was really boring. And I'm like, no, this is so important. This is where you get to explore what you want to do and think about different careers and know where you can go. And so if the state of Michigan is paying for this college career platform, how can you connect it to preschoolers, to the places that have child savings accounts, to college access networks, to people who do spend time with young adults who are trusted, who can help them navigate? Because right now, the employment and career landscape is getting more and more complicated. So when you have electric vehicles and IT and things are constantly changing and careers that didn't exist 5 years ago that exist now, it's hard for you all of us to make these kind of decisions, right? So for a young person who's in middle school and high school, if you could use these tools and then connect it to whatever economic resources that exist, then you have time to actually make informed choices. I think one of the biggest things about social mobility, in addition to maybe not having the money and not completing college, is you don't have the network, right? So someone says, oh yeah, I want to be a doctor, but I'm not very good at math and science. I've never talked to someone who's actually a physician. I don't know what it means to, go to undergrad and then go to medical school and then do residency. All those things are complicated. And if you don't know anybody who's done it, it might either seem that it's not for people like you or too difficult, or you face barriers you wouldn't have been aware of that if you'd had that conversation, you get it better. So I think In addition to the automatic enrollment and getting everybody in, figuring out how to build that trust and how to make sure systems are ready for all people to be successful and not just those who would have probably been successful anyways. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
It's a good answer.
What would the tax implications be for the family or for the child with this account?
Another good question. So when we were doing the savings and education, saving for education entrepreneur down payment, we actually negotiated with each state or city or whatever legislature to kind of say the money in these accounts, don't have it count against their asset limits and make them ineligible for food stamps, make them ineligible for housing. I mean, so we made agreements, right? But we had someone at this meeting that we had a month ago who used to be an IRS tax commissioner said, you don't want to rely on these individual kind of agreements. You really want to make sure that money that's going to, I mean, he was talking more about the guaranteed income ones. So money that went to guaranteed income wouldn't go against your tax implications, or for nonprofits that were given the money, that they'd have to pay all sorts of penalties for just being a pass-through. So they were talking about guaranteed income. But I think if you have national child development accounts, then you want to make sure there's two ways that it's being done now. So sometimes states and localities, even Washington County, they're putting all the money in an omnibus account. So every child that started school in the 2023-2024 school year, we know according to our records there's 1,500 or whatever of them, and they're all in this omnibus account, and all of them will get this money, and it's growing at a certain rate, and they'll be eligible for this when they get to be, high school graduates. And so that way it's not in the family's name, so it has no tax implications for the families. But I would say that if we do have something that's universal for everyone and it is in the family's names, then you have to make sure that you also work out the tax implications so that, one, they're not penalized in taxes, but two, when they're applying for colleges, it doesn't go against the amount that you think the family should be able to pay. So there's all sorts of recommendations about this, but until it becomes a national policy, there's not a national response.
So there's another online question that follows up on some of this, and I'm going to add a tag on at the end of it. So the question is, could you speak to some of the pros and cons of different administrative approaches to enrolling families in CDAs and related programs? And my tag on this is a Flint RX Kids tag. So I know that Luke and Mona, as they're running that program, are getting away from thinking about that as money at all and thinking about it as a prescription. Now it is money, right? But they're thinking of it as a prescription for the first year. And then that kind of shifts the narrative around it. So both administrative questions following on the tax question, and then also this kind of question of the narrative, money versus kind of other things in the space.
Okay. There's a lot of ways I can go with this. I think one way, when you're thinking about administrative, some of the things that happens when you are starting, let's say at kindergarten, or you're starting, not at birth, then it becomes, well, what about privacy? What about, who can share records or family information with whom? So in the places where it's done at birth, the treasurer's office communicates with the Department of Health and Human Services. And so when the child is born and given their social security number, it's automatically put through. And so then, one, because it's birth, you don't have to worry about things like immigration status or anything like that. I mean, if they're born in the country, they're automatically eligible. But then secondly, it's all with the administrative stream that's already happening. It's open and started. So one, you don't have to have the parents do anything. But secondly, every child that's born in a state, because if it's county, you might be born somewhere, you live somewhere else, but everything, as I said, statewide, everything that's born in the state, you have that record, and then you can create the account. So that's administratively the best way that it can be done. Okay. In terms of thinking about it, the way, let's go back to the programs that are happening in New York City. They're saying as this is an individual account, this is our community account. This is our children, our neighborhoods, our investment. And we all are doing all we can to help these kids be successful. So it's not like, oh, we're giving, $50 to this family. We're investing in our children so they can have a better future. And in addition to this monetary investment, we're also going to, give them books, or help with this or help with that, and it kind of becomes a whole package of things to make life better for our children, as opposed to giving money to a particular family. That's another way to think about it.
So your slide on CSAs and college attendance shows that there's a pretty strong association of pretty small amounts of money. How much of the effects of all of these programs is really the sort of psychological effect of the security of knowing that you have something, or the implication that there's a possibility you will go to college, versus the sort of marginal effects of setting or increasing the dollar amounts?
What a good question. Okay, there's a couple ways I can answer this. So I'd say yes, both the psychology around it, but also the fact that you have a longer period of time to have these conversations, to plan for the future, to say, what would I do if I had $2,000? And another thing about the amount, particularly as it relates to the cost of college, here at Michigan, University of Michigan, but all sorts of places, if you're below a certain income, you often have, free tuition, or, last dollar, account. So it's not paying for tuition, it's the money to buy books and to have a place to stay. So the amount of money can be smaller because you're not actually paying for college, you're paying for the registration fee to enroll. You're making sure that you're able to pay for your student activity fee and buy some books. Or you can say, if I work and have this money, it's doable, as opposed to having, tens of thousands of dollars of debt. So I think there's two things. One, yes, if you start young, there's all sorts of psychological things, all sorts of conversations, all sorts of, oh, people are investing in me. This thought about, we have evidence from the experiment that's been done on child accounts that parents are less likely to be depressed because they think there's something for their children, as opposed to them having to do it all themselves. So I think there are psychological things, but I think practically, particularly for low to moderate income families, there's lots of ways to pay for tuition, but having that little bit of extra could be the difference between staying in or dropping out, or being able to have one job as opposed to two jobs, so it makes it easier for you to actually successfully enroll and complete, because you have some resources as opposed to none.
We're getting close to the end of our time. Are there any other questions in the room? So we'll end with our final online question.
Okay.
Love the ideas of CDAs, CSAs, and IDAs. With employing over 50,000 people, are there any internal conversations happening to implement something for employees?
I'm not sure it would be a good idea. But at U of M, there is a match for your retirement savings. So in that sense, for the adults and their futures, there is something being done. But I am not aware of an internal conversation about helping children for college and their futures, but it's not a bad idea.
And there is if you're an employee, there is a tuition benefit for many employees for
you have to be in person to do.